Not that long ago, Atlas officially revealed Persona Q2 was coming to the 3DS. The game had been announced quite some time ago, but then seemingly went dormant. Now, of course, this is pretty typical for the developer, as they tend not to reveal the game after the announcement until it's nearly finished, with Persona 5 having been an exception due to it being delayed so heavily. The reveal was met with pretty good attention. Seriously, my first thoughts on Persona Q2's reveal has more views than the Resident Evil 2 remake or Devil May Cry 5 first thoughts videos. I don't even know how that happened. Anyway, weird viewing numbers aside, the announcement sufficiently motivated me to finish the first Persona Q, which I've had for quite some time and just had never gotten around to finishing. And finished it I have. I'm going to be covering my thoughts on the game from the perspective of the P3 team, although I've heard there's some various issues that arise if you play it from the P4 team that aren't present with the C's team and vice versa. I'll try to keep spoilers to a minimum, but this video may contain spoilers for Persona 3, Persona 4, and Persona Q, so if you're intending on playing those and don't want things revealed for you, I'd recommend you go finish them first. Now, since I have no method of recording my 3DS, I'm gonna have to just make do with a few clips from the trailers and a handful of images and whatnot. So, sorry, this probably won't be a visually spectacular review. Persona Q is as much a spin-off of the Etrian Odyssey series as it is the Persona franchise, and it shows. It feels vastly different from any previous entry, and really does very much feel like an entirely different game altogether, with only a few mechanics from the Shin Megami Tensei spin-off tacked on. The game is mostly played from a first-person perspective, and is primarily a dungeon crawler, which in some ways may actually remind you a bit of the original Persona if you've played it, but honestly it's a pretty skin-deep comparison. Unlike the later Persona titles, the gameplay focuses primarily on using the boost system, as opposed to locking down foes with their weaknesses and slamming them with an all-out attack. Rather than making the player carefully balance their SP, PQ expects you to be constantly using skills, at least to some degree, due to the game's sub-persona system, which I'll cover in a bit. When you strike enemies with their weaknesses or land a critical hit, instead of it knocking them down, you only have a low chance of knockdown. The Megiddo family of spells also has a higher rate of knockdown added. But instead, your character enters a slightly buffed state, which remains until you take your next action, or until an enemy hits you. While boosted, you get higher turn priority, you gain an increased 10% chance of getting a new persona at the end of battle for a character in the state, co-op attacks may activate, and all-out attacks may become more likely to happen. But the main draw is, while boosted, your character can use any skill in their arsenal for a cost of 0 SP or HP. I don't really mind the battle system, but it can be aggravating trying to build up a boost chain, only to have it ruined by an enemy spamming party spells, or just getting a lucky shot in. And it will happen. A lot. Even if you absorb the enemy's attack, you lose your boosts, which, honestly, that's just sheer bullshit. It didn't hurt, it healed me, so why did I lose my buff? For the most part, it basically works. The main problem lies in the HP-SP cost being perhaps a bit too high. HP cost can be somewhat negated, as the game does have a lot of great HP regen skills, particularly the leader skills Fuka has, along with the Healing Harp spell, which I pretty heavily abused during the game's final showdown. But the only characters that naturally regenerate SP are the duo of Zen and Rei, which actually has a pretty clever plot-related reason behind it. As for the HP-SP cost, there's a bit more behind that, so I'll explain when I get to the sub-personas. The game also has a strange way of handling buffs and duffs. Your normal SMT support skills are still present, but they seem a bit less useful. Stuff like Tsukukaja doesn't have the value it does in the main Persona games, and certainly nowhere near its meme-worthy helpfulness from the SMT games. They do still help, mind you, but there's a much larger emphasis on using binds comparatively. And being the tactical expert genius I am, I pretty much never used them. I totally should have, if for nothing else than at least the game's final boss fight, in his first form, who was a gigantic pile of aggravation without it. Status spells can also be fairly helpful, especially Panic, which can almost break the game at times. And because I'd be foolish not to mention it here, yeah, you can use it on the final boss's second form. Seriously, use it within pure reach, preferably with Naoto. I'll get to that later too, that's a lifesaver. And now we get to the sub-persona system. And I both love and hate this system. Sub-personas are equipable by the whole party, not just the protagonist this time around, which, again, might remind you a bit of the original Persona trilogy. Except you can't switch them in battle, which I'm actually okay with. I love the idea of being able to somewhat customize my party loadout this way, and it allows you to make some pretty lethal combinations. Here's the problem with the sub-personas. They only increase your HP and SP and give you new skills. You get no attribute buffs beyond passives, and you can't change your elements around at all. This means if you want to protect yourself from your weakness, you're gonna need either a passive skill that does so, or you're gonna need an item, meaning you're wasting a slot that could be used on more useful stuff. You could argue that's the case for your party in the mainline games, but it means the P3 protagonist has 2 weaknesses you have to cover. Luckily, the game doesn't end if your chosen hero dies, unlike the mainline entries. Unless you're playing on risky difficulty. Speaking of difficulties, as long as you're not playing on risky, you can change the game's difficulty at any time out of battle, which is a nice benefit if you find yourself stuck, or you find yourself wanting more of a challenge. As I mentioned, your sub-personas increase your HP and SP. However, it's more like they add their HP and SP to yours. After each battle, the equivalent amount is restored, effectively acting as regenerating HP and SP, but only for that specific amount. This allows you to somewhat use spells more frequently, but break that threshold and it digs into your natural HP and SP. And outside of battle, your sub-personas won't be in effect, so if you're in bad shape after a battle, you'll have to use some of your own SP to heal, unless you want to risk going into battle and healing there. This is compounded by your HP and SP not being restored when you return from a labyrinth. Instead, you have to visit the nurse's office and pay Elizabeth to restore you to full power, kind of like Trish in the original trilogy. The cost isn't generally too high, but you'll want to make sure you didn't blow all your cash on new equipment. Honestly, I found myself mostly just scraping by in regards to money up until the final dungeon, where suddenly I had more than I knew what to do with. The item shop is pretty much just the blacksmith from Persona 4 carried over. Kill enemies, get materials, sell them for cash, and Theodore creates new stuff for you. No real complaints here. Well, maybe one complaint. You can only hold 60 items. That's it. 60 items. This includes consumables, equipment not currently in use, skill cards, and materials. You can't upgrade this, you can't stack them, this is all you get. It's not a massive issue, but it gets pretty annoying when you're nearing the end of a long puzzle and suddenly you're being told that you're carrying too much stuff. Mercifully, plot-relevant items are not included in this, and there is a storage box in the workshop. And then, there's the dungeons. There's a total of 5 dungeons. You probably think, that's not so bad. The dungeons are awful. Okay, that's not entirely fair. I actually enjoyed the first 3 dungeons quite a bit. They're lengthy, but I don't think they quite overstayed their welcome. The first 2 are straightforward and have puzzles that work pretty well with the dungeon designs. The second dungeon in particular has a bunch of quizzes that result in some great character interactions, and ends up with you being matched with your destined partner. It's every bit as hilariously awkward as you probably think it is. There was also a great moment involving the group taking a break, playing a game, and it ended with someone, in my case Naoto, being forced to read one of Marie's poems. The third dungeon gets a bit more serious, and while it has a few aggravating moments, this is also where the plot really starts to kick into gear. It never gets as bad as, say, the 5th palace in Persona 5. It also benefits from an amazing puzzle where you have to guide Rei through the dark. Not only was it a fantastically designed, albeit simple puzzle, but it also serves as a wonderful character moment. But then you get to the Inaba Pride exhibit. The first 2 floors are fine. They drag maybe a little bit, but it never gets too bad. Then you get to the 3rd floor, and suddenly it becomes a Hamamudo spamfest with some obnoxious puzzles, irritating FOEs, and the 4th floor. Good grief, don't even get me started on the 4th floor. And as bad as that got, nothing could prepare me for the clock tower. There's a whopping 10 floors to this dungeon. Now to be fair, each of the first 7 floors are pretty small. but around the time I made it to the 3rd floor, it was already a pain in the ass. I was constantly getting caught off guard despite being a reasonable level, and at one point I very nearly died to a crowd of rare Megadolion spamming jackasses, only escaping with my protagonist alive with 3 HP and the rest of my party entirely wiped out. And seriously, rare my ass, I fought a half-dozen groups of those guys before I even made it to the 4th floor. And then there were the petrification spammers. If I'm being honest, I very nearly snapped my 3DS in half from the frustrations of the FOEs in the early parts of the dungeon due to them being able to leap from off-screen on the map, unless you were zoomed out on the map, the cheap spamming enemies, and a few puzzles that were borderline luck-based. I considered dropping down to safety just so I wouldn't have to redo some of that crap in case I died. Instead, I broke down and did what I really didn't want to and used the infamous impure reach on Naoto method, which very nearly breaks the game. Amusingly, the last infamous 2 floors of the final dungeon weren't nearly as bad as I had been led to believe. Many people claim they're the longest, most annoying floors in the game, but I found them to be considerably less frustrating for the most part. The puzzles in the floors were mostly clever, save for the annoying spiderweb ones, which I imagine mostly boil down to trial and error unless you're really aware of how the FOEs move there. I honestly couldn't be bothered by that point, so I just cheated and looked it up on the net. And no, I don't feel any shame for it. But legitimately, outside of those spiderweb puzzles, I enjoyed the last couple floors, even if I got lost for like an hour because I had missed a door on the 8th floor. I wish we'd had twice as many dungeons, with each one being half or less long. The game also has a pretty vast library of side quests given by Elizabeth. While a lot of these are simply, kill this enemy or get this thing, there's a few clever side stories that net you cool rewards, simply for picking the right choices, or some that require you to solve a simple puzzle. These aren't super necessary, but they do get you some good XP, and not just for your main team. Your whole roster gets the benefits, which is nice if you want to switch up the roster here or there. Surprisingly, most of the bosses were kind of a cakewalk, especially after some of the slogs it took to get to them. The exception is the final boss. The first form wasn't too hard, but took me forever to beat. Literally an hour and a half. The second form was easier, but you better bring a lot of revive items and spells for that fight, because of his cheap death countdown, or you might get lucky and cast Panic on him. Once again, thanks Naoto! This brings us to the story. A lot of people seem to really hate on the story, and I'm not entirely sure why. Personally, I think it's because a lot of people get the characters mixed up with the overall plot, and believe me, we'll get to that. It's either that or it's because it just kinda meanders around up until the end of the 3rd dungeon. It begins as a thinly veiled excuse to bring the P3 and P4 cast together, and eventually comes to focus on the nature of Zen and Rei's inner conflict. Before then, there's a lot of issues with the characterization and some sloppy plot elements, but once it hits at just what Zen and Rei are, it gets every bit as good as the mainline entries. The problem is, that comes at more than halfway through the game, and that's asking a lot of the player to wait through. To its credit, despite some of the characterization issues, the actual banter between the cast is absolutely amazing, with some pee-inducingly hysterical moments. Almost any joke involving Aigis or Narukami was priceless. Unfortunately, if it involved Akihiko or Teddy, it was probably just cringe-inducing. And that brings me to the characters. While I won't cover each one individually, I am going to remark about some of them. Everyone's heard how bad some of the characters got flanderized, but I'd like to take a moment to mention some of the characters I feel they got right. First is Aigis. Aigis was always a fan favorite, but damn it, she's outright adorable in this game. She has plenty of moments of her trying to discover her humanity, with plenty of fish out of water but the fish is a robot gags, and given the time frame of the game, it really fits. Her jokes were typically well timed, and when she had something heartfelt to say, it was usually really well done. Somebody hug this toaster. Next is Yu Narukami, the P4 protagonist. I feel like they nailed his personality quirks that were shown in Arena and Ultimax, while still remaining true to his silent protagonist origins from P4. He's got just the right amount of humor and seriousness, and him being so calm that people can't tell if he's serious or joking is played perfectly. Naoto Shirogane also seemed dead on. Can't really claim there was anything that felt out of character for her, as her straight-laced personality continued to shine through without making that her only trait. Also, she's objectively the best character in the game from a gameplay standpoint. That's not even a joke. She trivializes most of the game, and frankly, without her ability to obliterate shit so easily with a high luck stat, Hama, Mudo, and an added impure reach, I'd probably have come to hate the last 15 or so hours of the game. Makoto Yuki, the P3 protagonist. First, I'd like to be upfront about something. I really didn't like this guy in his own game. And yet, they made him work so well here. Instead of coming off as having no emotion and replying to everything with more ellipses than Squall Leonhardt, he comes off as a lazy bum with a bit of depression. His deadpan delivery is hilarious, and when Junpei accuses him of being lazy and pushing responsibility onto Narukami, he doesn't even pretend to deny it. Junpei's reaction to this is one of the best laughs in the game. There's also a great meta joke in him talking about drinking coffee, claiming that's why he's so charming. And even when playing as him, which I had to do a lot of with him as my chosen hero on my first playthrough, I felt like he had an actual variety of responses beyond emo brooding and ellipses. I legitimately liked him more here than I ever did in P3. Kuromaru. No real reason, I just like the dog. Ken Amada. If you've played through Persona 3, you know why this little shit is almost universally reviled, and why it took until Ultimax before anyone even pretended to like him. And even then, most people just picked him because he was in a duo with Kuromaru. Ken is fairly likable here. You see him suffering over his burden, not really knowing how to confront the man who killed his mother, and it makes it kind of heartbreaking that his character development is basically dropped. Perhaps the best part is Kanji trying to help him through his troubles. Speaking of which, Kanji is great in this game. He's so on point here and is genuinely funny and likable, just as he was in P4. And I want to give props to his voice actor, Matt Mercer, here. Apologies if I mispronounced that. For the longest time, Mercer just couldn't match Troy Baker's performance, and it's kind of understandable why. Baker is a tough act to follow. And Kanji might have been his best role ever, going from one amazing extreme to the other, something that Mercer could never quite pull off despite being an excellent voice actor with good range. However, I feel Mercer is entirely on point in this game, and there were times I legitimately forgot Troy Baker wasn't Kanji in this title. And then we have the bad characterizations, and oh boy do these ones hurt. Again, I'm not going to cover everyone, but I'll try to at least pick up on the worst ones. And the worst of the worst is poor Akihiko Sanada. Anyone who's played the other entries knows that Akihiko was a man driven by his desire to get stronger, out of frustration of losing his sister when the orphanage he grew up in burned down. He was socially awkward, not really understanding other people, but had a good heart and wouldn't turn away from a challenge or helping other people. He did have a slight quirk in that he was constantly training and didn't have a wide variety of things to talk about, and had a bit of a taste for protein powder and such things, which makes it hurt bad when his whole personality in Persona Q is almost literally protein, muscles, training, protein, muscles, and training! He had his moments where he might talk about that kind of stuff, with probably the worst being where it's implied that he had an addiction to protein powder in Arena, but even then, it was typically isolated incidents. In this, he constantly yammers on about protein and muscles. I think there's maybe a single cutscene in the entire game where he's not blathering about protein and muscles. Even Dragon Ball Son Goku would tell him to chill out on the obsessing about getting stronger, and he basically lives just to get stronger and fight. And then there's this asshole. Alright, Teddy has always been annoying, and he was probably the worst character in Persona 4. But he was a character in Persona 4. He had legitimate growth, and even if he could be annoying, I never outright hated the guy. There were times where him hitting on girls could actually be funny, especially when it blew up in his face. But in Persona Q, he does nothing but hit on girls. And while the rejections tend to be pretty funny, and I won't lie, I laughed pretty hard when the party straight up started ignoring him, he started grating on my nerves fast. We get it, he's a horny perv. But even Ryuji, and P4 Teddy put together weren't this obnoxiously lecherous. Remember how in Persona 4, Teddy didn't typically act like a jackass when things were serious? How when he questioned his own existence, it wasn't played for laughs, and made you genuinely feel concern for him? Don't expect that here, because he even uses his lack of understanding about who or what he is to hit on Rei. Honestly wish Zen had shot him a few times. Luckily, Aigis did. I could watch that on repeat for the rest of my life and never get sick of it.
Instant replay, please.
Now, a lot of people will probably want me to say Chie Satonaka is the next on the list. However, from the P3 side of things, I didn't really see that much different from how she was in P4. I'm told it's worse on the P4 side of things, or if she's in the party, so I won't discount that as a possibility, but from what I saw, her obsession with meat really wasn't any different than usual. But who I will talk about is Mitsuru Kirijo. Now, in all fairness, her characterization isn't as offensive as Teddy or Akihiko, but it is very odd. In the first half of the game, it's like she barely exists. She's there and occasionally spouts exposition, which isn't entirely out of character, but it lacks a lot of her better aspects. However, the study session with her and Junpei was fantastic. Now, one could potentially hand-wave this as being because she hasn't undergone her major character development in the timeline yet, except around the time you go into the haunted house, the third dungeon, suddenly she's constantly threatening to execute whoever pisses her off. In Persona 3, when she threatened something like this, it was genuinely intimidating. Now, I will say Teddy's obsession for being dominated by her was kind of funny, but that might just be because Narukami mentioned finding it potentially arousing too. To Mitsuru's credit, the part where you can try scaring her in the haunted house during the game's ending, and I guess its follow-up, is possibly one of the funniest moments in the entire series. The last characters I want to cover are the duo of Rei and Zen, Persona Q's central story focus, and I gotta say, I adore these two. While on a surface level they seem just like a guy with no social skills and a hungry dimwit, there's so much more to them. And hey, both of those aspects are actually plot relevant! I'm not even kidding about that. Zen being antisocial and constantly misunderstanding things, along with Rei constantly scarfing down food and being obsessed with eating, are all explained in-universe. And holy shit, when it hits hard. Ashley Birch provides a fantastic performance, going from highly energetic and happy to truly heart-wrenchingly hurt. And Keith Silverstein gives one of the strongest performances I've ever heard in any game as Zen, once the mystery of the game's story begins to unravel. And seriously, if the reveal of what Rei's name means doesn't make you feel the feels, you have no heart. I will gladly say that it was thanks to these two that I was able to enjoy Persona Q as much as I did, despite the frustrations toward the end. Of course, while the voice acting is fantastic, as usual, what really makes the game audible bliss is the soundtrack. As expected, Shoji Meguro composed some absolutely incredible tracks for the game on par with the rest of the modern entries. The P3 version of Light the Fire Up in the Night might be my second favorite battle theme, just after the PSP version of the first game's A Lone Prayer. The game's opening theme, Maze of Life, is super catchy and is remixed into the fourth boss's theme, Friends, to powerful effect. As to be expected, Lotus Juice, Yumi Kawamura, and Chihoko Hirata give their all in each vocal theme. I also don't believe I touched on the graphics yet. Visually, the game looks great. The character models are well animated, colorful, and expressive thanks in part to the game's art style. I wasn't a huge fan of the art style at first, but it has grown on me over time. Probably due to Aigis' happy face. It's just so damn adorable. I still prefer the Soejima art style from P3 through P5, but for a spin-off, this is fine, and it's used well in the game itself. The cutscenes look great and are given a good amount of weight. The normal conversations look good too. While I personally like the drawn portraits from the mainline entries, these characters look so great in motion that I can't really complain. The only downside is sometimes their expressions seem to change while talking, especially on Junpei and Teddy, who will frequently have their mouths moving in a happy grin or exaggerated goofy face, only to end with them looking sad afterward, which kinda bugs me. The brief animated sequences also look fantastic. Though used sparingly, when one does crop up, it always fits the moment. The animation quality is great, and something about the use of color is amazing. I dare say that I think an entire anime series based on this style would be preferable to the somewhat half-assedness of the P4 and P5 TV shows. Actually, I think given how the game has less of a focus on individual character development in general, it'd work better as an anime than the mainline entries. The majority of the 65 or so hours I played was in the dungeons, as opposed to how much heavier the character interactions are in the mainline entries. Now, regarding the Naoto Impure Reach method I keep mentioning, I'll explain it to you. As I mentioned before, she naturally learns Hama and Mudo, and she has a high luck stat. This means she has a massive chance of one-shotting enemies since both spells are kill moves. She's also the second fastest party member in the game, with only Koromaru being faster. This means she can easily wipe out enemy parties before they can even act. Impure Reach increases the chance of status effects landing. Hama and Mudo's instant kill effects are technically counted as status effects. Oh yeah! High luck, plus instant kills, plus a higher chance of landing said instant kills. This becomes so effective that you can usually slaughter an enemy who resists Hama and Mudo. As long as they can't outright nullify it, it seems to kill them more often than not. Add Tetarafu onto this, now's a high chance of inflicting panic. Panic works on a few bosses, including the final boss. You can get a skill card for it pretty easily and pretty early, too. Basically, Naoto, by herself, is an easy win button. Naoto, with Impure Reach, becomes the I win button. The game also features a New Game Plus option, although it's handled a bit differently than usual. Namely that you select it from the normal New Game option and simply import your save, as opposed to just selecting the save from the load menu. This means you can do stuff like side quests or grinding even post-game. I'm ultimately indifferent towards this. As for the features of New Game Plus, I'm not sure how I feel. It almost seems like it gives you too much. You keep everything. All your levels, skills, sub-personas, equipment, items, item unlocks, maps, money, and awakened personas. On the plus side, with how long some of the dungeons can drag, I'm also kinda happy the game lets you keep everything. It makes getting the ultimate personas much easier since you need both Narukami and Yuki at level 55 to unlock them. I don't know. I can't help but feel like having an option as to what you keep beyond everything might have been a nice addition. But really, that's more nitpicky than anything. It does make playing through the other side of the story much less of a pain overall. At the end of the day, I can safely say I enjoyed Persona Q, even if I didn't enjoy it as much as the mainline entries, save for maybe Innocent Sin. Despite the characterization issues, the plot waiting a bit too long to really kick into gear, and the last chunk of the game becoming an obnoxious slog, I enjoyed the banter, thought the battle system had some cool ideas, albeit in a rough execution, great music and voice acting, and once it got moving, the genuinely heartfelt story. Even the end credits gave me the warm fuzzies, and not just because I wanted the game to end. They're adorable and heartwarming, giving the game a satisfying conclusion. But while I do think Persona Q is a good game despite its noticeable flaws, I hesitate recommending it outright. If you go into it expecting the modern mainline entries, then you'd best skip it, especially if you're hoping for the characters to be fully on point to their standard incarnations. If you approach it more in line with the original trilogy, you may find it a bit more comfortable, and if you just want a dungeon-romping adventure, you'll probably find yourself right at home. Seeing as how I haven't actually played an Etrian Odyssey game, I can't comment as to how it compares, though I'm told EO is more challenging, but is a lot less of a drag at times. Persona Q is a good game, with glaring flaws that do distract from its qualities, but the good does outweigh the bad for the most part. While I'm hoping Persona Q fixes some of the balancing issues, and maybe gives us more dungeons that last less time, I can't say my time was wasted here. 65 hours for my first run was a good length, even if a few parts really did drag. I don't see Persona Q replacing the mainline entries at any point, but I honestly wouldn't complain if a few aspects, most notably the cool sub-Persona concept, make their way into the rest of the series. Hopefully Persona Q2 will be able to match my enjoyment with this game and surpass it. I'd recommend trying the game before buying, if possible, but if it sounds like this dungeon-crawling focused spin-off is more your style, you should just go for it. Just make sure to bring Naoto along for the ride. Would I let this version of I Guess watch me sleep? You bet your sweet bippy I would. And let's be honest, I'd let her watch me sleep anyway. Thank you guys so much for watching. Agree? Disagree? Let me know in the comments. If you want some more Persona goodness, why not check out my first thoughts on the Persona Q2 reveal? Or if you just want something with minimal substance, why not check out my bloated hour-and-a-half long 500 subscribers tribute video?